The rusted padlock on the steel hatch gave way with a single strike from the crowbar, and as Thomas Mercer pulled open the heavy door, a gust of stale air rushed up from the darkness below. His Belgian Malinois, Copper, immediately backed away from the opening, ears flat against his skull, a behavior Thomas had never seen from the fearless animal in all their years together. Something was down there. Something that had been sealed away for a very long time. And in that moment, staring into the black void that had opened up on his own property, Thomas understood that his quiet life of solitude was about to shatter into 1,000 irretrievable pieces. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like every other morning for the past 3 years. Thomas woke at dawn without the need for an alarm, a habit carved into him by 2 decades in the Marine Corps that civilian life had never managed to erase. At 42 years old, he looked older than his years would suggest. The lines around his eyes were deep, etched there by the unforgiving sun of Iraq and the weight of memories he carried from Fallujah. His hair, once dark as coal, was now streaked with silver at the temples, and his broad frame, though still powerful, had grown leaner during his years of self-imposed isolation on the 40-acre property in rural Virginia. He lived in a small farmhouse that had belonged to his grandfather, a simple 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on the eastern side. The house sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by dense woods of oak and pine that provided a natural barrier between Thomas and the rest of the world. It was exactly what he needed. A place where the only sounds were wind through leaves, the occasional cry of a hawk, and the blessed absence of human voices asking questions he did not want to answer. Thomas pulled on his worn canvas work pants and a faded green thermal shirt, the fabric soft from countless washings. His feet found his scuffed leather boots by muscle memory alone. In the small kitchen, he started the coffee maker, an old percolator that had survived 3 deployments in various military housing units before retiring with him to Virginia. While the coffee brewed, filling the quiet house with its rich aroma, Thomas stood at the window and watched the sun break over the tree line, painting the frost-covered grass in shades of gold and amber. Copper was waiting by the back door, as he always was. The dog was 4 years old, 70 pounds of muscle and loyalty wrapped in a coat of rich tan and black. Thomas had gotten him from a veteran service dog organization 2 years ago, though he had resisted the idea at first. He did not think he needed help. He did not want to admit that the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the crushing isolation were problems that required solutions. But his sister, the only family member he still spoke to with any regularity, had insisted. She had filled out the application herself, driven 6 hours to deliver the dog personally, and refused to leave until Thomas promised to give it a real try. Copper had changed everything. The dog did not ask questions. He did not offer platitudes about service and sacrifice. He simply existed alongside Thomas with a steady, uncomplicated presence that somehow made the weight of each day more bearable. On the nights when Thomas woke gasping from dreams of smoke and screaming, Copper was there, a warm solid pressure against his side that anchored him back to reality. During the long afternoons when the silence felt too heavy, Copper would nudge his hand or drop a rope toy at his feet, a gentle insistence on engagement with the present moment. Thomas poured his coffee into a chipped ceramic mug and opened the back door. Copper bounded out into the cold morning air, his breath creating small clouds of mist. Thomas followed, sipping the bitter coffee and watching the dog make his usual patrol of the immediate yard. It was a routine they had perfected over 2 years. After coffee, they would walk the property line, a daily inspection that took about 2 hours and covered most of the 40 acres Thomas owned. The property had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had bought it in the 1950s, a struggling tobacco farm that he had transformed into a modest tree farm. Thomas's father had continued the tradition, planting rows of Christmas trees and selling them each December to families from the surrounding counties. But Thomas had no interest in continuing the business. The trees grew wild now, untended and unsold. He kept the land because it was his, because it was quiet, and because he had nowhere else to go. They set out along the familiar path, Thomas carrying a walking stick he had carved from an oak branch, Copper ranging ahead with his nose to the ground. The frost crunched under Thomas's boots, and his breath hung in the still air. This was his meditation, his therapy. The repetitive motion of walking, the careful observation of his land, the small changes he noticed from day to day. A fallen branch here, fresh deer tracks there, the slow advance of honeysuckle vines reclaiming an old stone wall. They were about a mile from the house, in the northwestern corner of the property, when Copper stopped. The dog froze mid-step, one paw raised, his entire body going rigid. Thomas stopped too, his hand instinctively tightening on the walking stick. His eyes scanned the tree line, looking for movement, for threat. But there was nothing. Just trees and undergrowth and the same landscape he had walked 100 times before. Copper turned his head slowly to the left, his nostrils flaring. Then he did something unusual. He looked back at Thomas, made direct eye contact, and whined. It was a high, urgent sound that Thomas had only heard once before, when Copper had detected a copperhead snake coiled near the back porch. The dog was alerting to danger, but there was something else in his posture. Curiosity. Confusion. Thomas moved forward carefully, coming up beside Copper. He followed the dog's gaze to a dense thicket of wild blackberry bushes and young saplings. At first, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. But Copper was insistent. The dog moved forward slowly, pushing his way into the undergrowth, and Thomas had no choice but to follow. The thorns caught at his clothes and scratched his hands as he pushed through the tangle. Copper was just ahead, his tan coat visible through the branches. And then Thomas saw it. A section of earth that did not match the surrounding forest floor. While everything around them was covered in fallen leaves and organic debris, this spot was different. The ground here was sunken slightly, as if the earth had settled over something hollow beneath. And there, barely visible under decades of accumulated leaf litter and dirt, was a straight edge. Man-made. Deliberate. Thomas knelt down, his heart beginning to pound with a rhythm he recognized from his combat days. Adrenaline was already flooding his system, sharpening his senses. He used his hands to brush away the leaves, then pulled his walking stick into service as a digging tool. Copper sat back on his haunches, watching intently as Thomas worked. The straight edge revealed itself to be metal. Old metal, covered in rust and corrosion, but unmistakably manufactured. Thomas dug faster, clearing away decades of forest debris. Within 20 minutes, he had exposed a rectangular shape approximately 4 feet by 3 feet. It was a hatch. A steel hatch with a heavy padlock securing it shut. Thomas sat back on his heels, his mind racing. He had owned this property for 3 years. Before that, his father had owned it for 40 years. His grandfather before that. None of them had ever mentioned a hatch, a bunker, any kind of underground structure. He tried to remember if his grandfather had served in the military. No, the old man had been too young for World War II and too old for Korea. There was no reason for a military bunker on private farmland in rural Virginia. Unless it was not military. Thomas stood up and examined the area more carefully. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see other signs of human activity that had been invisible before. The trees here were younger than those in the surrounding forest, suggesting this area had been cleared at some point and allowed to regrow. There was a faint depression in the earth leading away from the hatch, possibly an old access road long since reclaimed by nature. And when he looked closely at the hatch itself, he could see that the metal, despite its rust, was thick and substantial. This was serious construction, built to last. Copper whined again, softer this time. The dog approached the hatch and sniffed at the edges, then backed away quickly, shaking his head as if trying to clear his nostrils of an unpleasant scent. Thomas made a decision. He needed tools. Real tools. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He marked the location carefully in his mind, noting the 3 tall white pines that formed a triangle around the clearing, then headed back to the house with Copper at his side. The walk back felt longer than usual. His mind was churning with possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. A bootlegger's cache from Prohibition? A Cold War-era fallout shelter built by a paranoid previous owner? A forgotten root cellar that had somehow never made it onto any property survey? At the house, Thomas gathered supplies. A heavy crowbar from the barn. A powerful LED flashlight. His Leatherman multi-tool. A first aid kit, because he had learned long ago that preparation prevented catastrophe. He filled a water bottle and grabbed a handful of granola bars, though he did not expect to be gone long. He also retrieved something he had not touched in over a year. From the locked safe in his bedroom closet, he removed his Sig Sauer M17, the same model he had carried in the service, and 2 loaded magazines. He checked the weapon with practiced efficiency, verified the safety, and holstered it at his hip. Copper watched these preparations with interest, his tail wagging slightly. The dog could sense that something unusual was happening, and unlike Thomas, Copper seemed excited rather than apprehensive. They made the return journey in 45 minutes, moving faster now that Thomas knew exactly where he was going. When they reached the hidden hatch, Thomas knelt beside it and examined the padlock more carefully. It was old, probably original to the installation, and the rust had done more damage than decades of weather alone could explain. The locking mechanism was seized. Whatever this hatch protected, no one had opened it in a very long time. Thomas positioned the crowbar against the lock shackle and threw his weight against it. The corroded metal resisted for a moment, then gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the quiet forest. The padlock fell away in pieces, leaving the hatch unsecured. Thomas brushed away the remaining debris from around the edges of the door and found a recessed handle. He gripped it firmly, braced his feet, and pulled. The hinges screamed in protest, their decades-old lubrication long since dried to nothing. The hatch moved slowly, grudgingly, rising inch by inch until Thomas could prop it fully open. A wave of stale, musty air rushed up from the darkness below, carrying with it the smell of damp concrete and something else. Something metallic and faintly chemical that Thomas could not quite identify. He clicked on the flashlight and aimed the beam down into the opening. A ladder descended into darkness, its metal rungs spotted with rust but still intact. The shaft went down approximately 12 feet by Thomas's estimation, ending at a concrete floor. At the bottom, his light revealed the edge of a doorway leading into a larger space. Copper approached the opening again, sniffing cautiously, but when Thomas started to descend the ladder, the dog balked. He whined, planted his feet, and refused to follow. Thomas had never known Copper to refuse an order or fail to follow him anywhere. The dog's reluctance sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold air rising from the bunker. Thomas descended slowly, testing each rung before trusting it with his full weight. The ladder held, though it creaked ominously under his 200 pounds. When his feet touched the concrete floor, he swept the flashlight beam around the small chamber. It was about 8 feet square, with concrete walls that showed water stains and mineral deposits from decades of seepage. The doorway ahead was open, a black rectangle leading deeper into the underground structure. Above him, framed in the square of gray daylight, Coppa's silhouette was visible. The dog was lying down at the edge of the opening, his head on his paws, clearly waiting but unwilling to descend. Thomas made a decision. If Coppa's instincts told him to stay up top, then that was probably wise. Thomas had survived 2 tours in Iraq by trusting his instincts and the instincts of those around him. He was not about to stop now. He moved through the doorway into the main chamber of the bunker. His flashlight beam revealed a space much larger than he had anticipated. The room was roughly 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough that Thomas could stand upright with room to spare. The walls were lined with metal shelving units, most of them still standing despite the years of neglect. And on those shelves, covered in dust and cobwebs, were supplies. Thomas moved closer, his light playing over the items. There were crates of canned goods, their labels faded but still readable. Beans, vegetables, condensed milk, all brands from the 1960s and 70s based on the packaging designs. There were large plastic drums that, when Thomas tapped them with his knuckle, sounded full. Probably water storage. There were blankets wrapped in plastic, boxes labeled as medical supplies, and several sealed metal containers marked with radiation warnings. This was a fallout shelter. A serious, well-stocked Cold War-era fallout shelter. But why here? Why on his family's land? And why had no one ever mentioned it? Thomas moved deeper into the bunker, his flashlight revealing more details. Against the far wall was a small generator, a vintage model that looked like it had never been used. Next to it were several metal drums marked as diesel fuel. There was a chemical toilet in one corner, still sealed in its original packaging. A folding cot frame leaning against the wall. A battery-powered radio on one of the shelves. But it was what he found on a small metal desk in the corner that made Thomas's blood run cold. The desk held a leather-bound journal, its cover warped by moisture but still intact. Next to it was a metal lockbox, smaller than a shoebox, with a combination lock that had succumbed to rust. The lock hung loose, already broken. Thomas picked up the journal carefully. The leather was soft and damp in his hands. He opened it to the first page and read the inscription written in neat, careful handwriting. Property of Richard Mercer. March 1962. Richard Mercer. Thomas's grandfather. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. The entries were sporadic, dated across several years in the early 1960s. His grandfather's handwriting filled the pages with observations, supply inventories, and increasingly paranoid musings about the state of the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis featured prominently, along with references to nuclear testing, Soviet aggression, and the certainty of impending atomic war. But then the entries changed. Starting in late 1963, the tone shifted from fearful preparation to something darker. His grandfather wrote about visitors. About men in suits asking questions about his property, about the government's interest in the land, about offers to purchase that became threats when he refused. There were references to things his grandfather had seen, things he should not have seen. Planes flying low at night. Trucks on unmarked roads. Lights in the forest where no lights should be. And then there were gaps. Weeks, then months between entries. When the writing resumed, it was different. More erratic. Less coherent. His grandfather wrote about being watched, about men following him into town, about phone calls in the middle of the night with no one on the other end. He wrote about hiding something, about ensuring the truth would survive even if he did not. The final entry was dated April 1964. It was short, just 3 sentences in his grandfather's shaking handwriting. They know I have it. I have hidden it where only family will find it. If you are reading this, trust no one. Thomas closed the journal, his mind reeling. His grandfather had died in 1965, officially from a heart attack while working in the fields. Thomas had been a child, too young to remember him clearly. His father had never spoken much about the old man, always changing the subject when Thomas asked questions. He had assumed it was simply grief, the pain of losing a parent. But now he wondered if it had been something else. Fear. Or guilt. He turned his attention to the metal lockbox. With the lock already broken, he lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in an oilcloth, was a large manila envelope. The paper was yellowed and brittle, but when Thomas carefully opened it, the contents were preserved. Photographs. Dozens of black and white photographs. Thomas spread them out on the desk, his flashlight beam moving from image to image. They showed trucks, military-style vehicles but with no identifying markings. They showed men in civilian clothes carrying large containers. They showed a section of forest that Thomas recognized immediately as part of his own property, though the trees were younger and the landscape less overgrown. In the center of several photographs was a large concrete structure, partially built, with rebar exposed and construction equipment visible. But it was the last photograph that made Thomas's stomach turn. It showed a group of barrels, industrial drums, arranged in neat rows. Each barrel was marked with a symbol that Thomas had seen before during his military training. A trefoil, the universal symbol for radioactive material. His grandfather had documented an illegal dumping operation. Radioactive waste, buried on private land, hidden from oversight and regulation. And someone had known that he knew. Thomas carefully returned everything to the lockbox and closed it. He took the journal as well, tucking both items inside his jacket. His mind was racing through the implications. If this was real, if his grandfather had truly witnessed and documented illegal disposal of nuclear waste, then this land was potentially contaminated. His land. The place he had thought was safe, clean, isolated. The water table could be poisoned. The soil could be toxic. And he had been living here for 3 years, drinking from the well, eating vegetables from the garden, breathing the air. But more immediately concerning was a different question. If someone had gone to the trouble of threatening his grandfather, possibly even killing him, to keep this secret, what would they do now if they knew the evidence had been found? Thomas moved quickly back through the bunker, his flashlight beam sweeping across the shelves of forgotten supplies. He needed to get out, needed to think, needed to figure out his next move. As he reached the ladder and looked up toward the square of daylight, he saw Kappa's silhouette still there, still waiting. But there was something else. A sound. Faint and distant, but growing closer. The unmistakable sound of vehicle engines. Thomas killed his flashlight immediately, plunging himself into darkness. He climbed the ladder as quietly as possible, his heart hammering in his chest. When he reached the surface, Kappa was standing now, his ears forward, his body tense. The dog was looking toward the east, toward the old logging road that technically provided access to this part of the property but had been impassable for years. The engine sounds were closer now. Multiple vehicles, moving slowly, crushing undergrowth as they advanced. Thomas grabbed the hatch and lowered it as gently as he could, trying to minimize the screech of protesting hinges. He kicked leaves and debris over it, a hasty camouflage job that would not survive close inspection but might work from a distance. Then he and Kappa melted into the forest, moving quickly and quietly away from the clearing. Thomas's training took over, his body remembering skills he had not used in years. He moved from cover to cover, using the terrain, staying low. Kappa stayed close, his paws silent on the forest floor, his breathing controlled despite the pace. They covered a quarter mile before Thomas stopped, finding concealment in a dense stand of mountain laurel. From here, he had a sight line back toward the hatch location. He pulled out a small pair of binoculars from his jacket pocket, a habit from his hunting days, and trained them on the clearing. 3 vehicles emerged from the tree line. 2 were dark SUVs with tinted windows, expensive models that looked absurdly out of place in the rough terrain. The third was a pickup truck, older and more appropriate for the location. 6 men emerged from the vehicles. They were dressed in casual outdoor clothing, jeans and work jackets, but something about the way they moved told Thomas they were not casual hikers. They moved with purpose and coordination, spreading out to search the area. One man stood apart from the others. He was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and an expensive jacket. He held a tablet computer and seemed to be consulting some kind of map or survey data. He pointed, giving directions, and the other men fanned out. Thomas watched through the binoculars as one of the searchers nearly walked right past the hatch location, then stopped. The man called out, and the others converged on the spot. They cleared away Thomas's hasty camouflage work in seconds, exposing the hatch. The silver-haired man approached, knelt beside the opening, and examined the broken padlock. Then he stood up and looked around the forest, his gaze sweeping across the terrain. For a moment, Thomas felt as if the man was looking directly at him, though he knew that was impossible. The distance was too great, his concealment too good. The man pulled out a cell phone and made a call. Thomas could not hear the words, but the body language was clear. Anger. Urgency. When the call ended, the man issued orders to his team. 2 of them descended into the bunker. The others began a wider search pattern, spreading out through the forest. Thomas knew he had to move. If they found his tracks, if they had dogs of their own, if they had any competent trackers in that group, they would eventually find him. And he had no illusions about what would happen then. Whatever his grandfather had stumbled onto was still dangerous enough that people were actively protecting the secret. The way the men moved, the equipment they had, the coordination of their search, all of it spoke to organization and resources. He tapped Kappa's shoulder, a signal they had practiced. Time to go. They moved deeper into the forest, paralleling the property line but staying well inside the trees. Thomas's mind raced as he moved. He needed to get back to the house, needed to secure the evidence, needed to figure out who he could trust with this information. The local police? The sheriff's department? How deep did this go? How many people were complicit or compromised? His grandfather's final warning echoed in his mind. Trust no one. They were 2 miles from the house, moving through a dense section of pine forest, when Kappa stopped again. This time the dog did not just freeze. He dropped low, his belly to the ground, and a growl rumbled deep in his chest. Thomas immediately dropped into a crouch, his hand going to the pistol at his hip. Voices ahead. Men talking in low tones. Thomas bellied forward through the undergrowth until he could see them. 2 more men, different from the group at the bunker, positioned on a small rise that overlooked the approach to his house. They had rifles, expensive hunting models with high-powered scopes. They were not hiding, exactly, but they were stationed like guards, like sentries. They were watching his house. Thomas lay motionless in the undergrowth, his breathing slow and controlled, watching the 2 armed men through a gap in the pine branches. They were professionals, that much was clear from their positioning and the way they scanned the approaches to his property with methodical precision. One of them lifted a radio to his mouth and spoke in tones too low for Thomas to make out the words. The other kept his rifle scope trained on the farmhouse, sweeping slowly from window to window. Kappa remained perfectly still beside Thomas, his training evident in the way he held his position without a sound. The dog's eyes were fixed on the men, his muscles coiled and ready, but he waited for Thomas's command. They had practiced this kind of patience before, during their long days in the woods, though Thomas had never imagined he would need these skills on his own land. The reality of his situation crystallized in Thomas's mind with brutal clarity. His house was being watched. The bunker site was being searched. There were at least 8 men that he knew of, possibly more, all coordinated and equipped with communications gear and weapons. This was not some random event or coincidence. Someone had been monitoring his property, waiting for him to find what his grandfather had hidden. The broken padlock was fresh, the rust disturbed. They had known, somehow, that the bunker had been opened for the first time in decades. Which meant they had been watching him. For how long? Days? Weeks? The thought sent ice through his veins. He thought back over the past few weeks, trying to remember anything unusual. Had there been strange vehicles on the main road? Unfamiliar faces in town? He made so few trips into the nearby community of Riverside that he might not have noticed. His isolation, which had felt like protection, had actually made him vulnerable. No one would miss him if he disappeared. No one checked on him except his sister, and she only called once a month. Thomas needed to think strategically. The men watching his house would have clear sight lines on all the main approaches. The driveway was obviously out of the question. The direct path through the woods from his current position would bring him too close to their position. But there was another way. Years ago, his father had maintained a network of deer trails and hunting paths throughout the property. One of those paths ran along the southern boundary, following a seasonal creek bed that would be mostly dry this time of year. It would add over a mile to the journey, but it would bring him to the house from an angle the watchers might not have covered. He backed away slowly, keeping low, moving with the painstaking care of a man who knew that a single snapped twig could mean death. Copper followed his lead, the dog's paws finding purchase on silent patches of moss and bare earth. They moved for 10 minutes before Thomas felt safe enough to rise to a crouch, and another 10 before he risked standing fully upright. The detour took them through the oldest part of the forest, where massive oaks towered overhead and the understory was relatively clear. Thomas moved quickly now, his eyes constantly scanning for movement, his ears straining for any sound that did not belong. The creek bed appeared ahead, a winding channel of smooth stones and exposed roots. During spring rains it would be a rushing torrent, but now it was just damp earth and scattered pools of standing water. They followed the creek bed south, then curved back toward the north and east. Thomas checked his watch. Nearly 2 hours had passed since he had first opened the bunker hatch. The sun was climbing toward noon, and his stomach reminded him that he had not eaten since his early morning coffee. But hunger was the least of his concerns. As they approached the house from the south, Thomas slowed to a crawl. He found a position in a dense stand of rhododendrons that gave him a view of the back of the farmhouse. Everything looked normal. The back door was closed. The windows were intact. His truck sat where he had left it in the gravel parking area beside the barn. But normal meant nothing. They could be inside already, waiting for him to return. Thomas watched for 15 minutes, looking for any sign of disturbance, any indication that the house had been entered. Nothing moved. No shadows passed behind the windows. No vehicles appeared on the driveway. Finally, he made his decision. He had to get inside. The evidence from the bunker was in his jacket, but there were other things he needed. His laptop with its encrypted hard drive. The copies of his military records and the property deeds he kept in his safe. Money. More ammunition. And he needed to make contact with someone outside this situation, someone who could serve as a failsafe if things went wrong. He signaled to Copper, a command to stay and watch, then moved toward the house in a low run. He crossed the open ground between the tree line and the barn in seconds, pressing himself against the weathered wood siding. He paused, listening. Still nothing. He moved along the side of the barn to the corner, where he had a clear view of the back door of the house. The door was ajar. Just slightly, perhaps an inch, but Thomas knew with absolute certainty that he had closed and locked it when he left that morning. Someone had been inside. Someone might still be inside. Thomas drew his pistol, checking the chamber by feel alone. He moved to the back porch, testing each wooden step for creaks before trusting it with his weight. At the door, he paused again, listening. The house was silent. He pushed the door open slowly with his foot, the pistol up and ready. The kitchen was empty but disturbed. Drawers had been opened and not fully closed. Cabinet doors hung slightly ajar. They had searched the place, and they had not been particularly careful about hiding it. Thomas moved through the ground floor room by room, clearing each space with the mechanical precision of his military training. Living room clear. Dining room clear. His small office, really just a converted closet with a desk, had been thoroughly ransacked. Papers were scattered across the floor. The desk drawers hung open, their contents dumped. His laptop was gone. Upstairs was the same story. His bedroom had been searched, his clothes pulled from drawers and closet. The bathroom was untouched, not worth their time. The spare bedroom, which he used for storage, had been torn apart. Boxes had been opened and their contents strewn across the floor. But they had missed something. In the bedroom closet, behind a false panel Thomas had installed himself, was a small wall safe. It was still secure, still hidden behind the intact panel. Thomas worked quickly, spinning the combination lock by feel. Inside were the items he needed most. $5,000 in cash, money he had saved from his military pay and disability checks. A second pistol, a compact 9mm. Extra magazines for both weapons. A thumb drive containing scanned copies of important documents. And most importantly, a prepaid cell phone that he kept charged but had never used, still in its original packaging. Thomas stuffed everything into a small backpack he pulled from the closet floor. He added a change of clothes, a water filter, energy bars from his emergency supplies, and a folding knife. The bag was not heavy, but it represented mobility and options. As long as he had these supplies, he could stay ahead of whoever was hunting him. He was back in the kitchen, about to leave through the back door, when he heard it. The crunch of tires on gravel. A vehicle was coming up the driveway. Thomas moved to the window and risked a glance. One of the dark SUVs from the bunker site was approaching the house. It pulled to a stop near his truck, and two men got out. One was the silver-haired man Thomas had seen giving orders at the bunker. The other was younger, built like a linebacker, with a shaved head and a bulge under his jacket that suggested a shoulder holster. Thomas had seconds to decide. The back door would put him in the open for too long. They would see him. The basement was a trap, only one way in or out. His eyes landed on the pantry, a narrow walk-in closet off the kitchen. It was not a good hiding place, but it was his only option. He slipped inside, pulling the door close to within an inch of the frame, leaving himself a narrow line of sight into the kitchen. The front door opened. Footsteps on the wooden floor, 2 sets, moving with confidence. They knew the house was empty. They had already searched it. This was just a follow-up, a final check. The silver-haired man spoke, his voice cultured and educated, with a hint of a southern accent. Check the kitchen again. He was specific about needing supplies for an extended stay. Anything camping-related, survival gear, weapons. Our friend is going to ground, and I want to know what resources he has available. The younger man grunted acknowledgement and moved into the kitchen. Thomas held his breath, his body pressed against the pantry's back wall. Through the gap in the door, he could see the man opening cabinets, checking the refrigerator, examining the mudroom by the back door where Thomas kept his outdoor gear. The younger man spoke with a thick Boston accent. His camping stuff is gone. Backpack that was here this morning, that's missing too. I'd say he grabbed essentials and ran. Good, the silver-haired man replied, his voice coming from the direction of the living room. That makes him predictable. A man running in familiar territory will follow patterns. Alert the perimeter teams. I want the main roads covered in observation on the Blackwater Trail. It's the fastest route to Riverside, and he'll need to make contact with someone eventually. Everyone needs help sooner or later. What about the sister? She lives over in Richmond, right? Already covered. We have a team watching her apartment. If he tries to reach out, we'll know. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. They had done their homework. They knew about his sister, knew about the trails on his property, probably knew everything about his habits and routines. This was not some hastily organized response. This was a planned operation, possibly set in motion the moment he broke that padlock. The younger man was still moving around the kitchen. He pulled open a few more drawers, checked under the sink, then moved toward the pantry. Thomas's hand tightened on his pistol. If the door opened, he would have no choice. He would have to shoot, and then everything would spiral into open violence. The man's hand touched the pantry doorknob. Then his radio crackled. All units, we have a possible sighting on the northwest quadrant. Canine tracks heading toward the ridgeline. The man's hand left the doorknob. He lifted the radio. On our way. He turned and called out. Boss, they might have something. The silver-haired man appeared in the kitchen doorway. Let's go. And call Mr. Hendricks. Tell him the situation is contained but fluid. He'll want to manage the broader response. They left through the front door, their footsteps fading. The SUV's engine started, and Thomas heard the crunch of gravel as they drove away. He waited a full 5 minutes, listening to the silence, before he allowed himself to move. His heart was hammering, his hands slick with sweat despite the cold. That had been too close. He emerged from the pantry, moved to the window, and confirmed the driveway was clear. Then he slipped out the back door, whistled softly for Copper, and jogged back to the tree line. The dog appeared from the rhododendrons, tail wagging slightly, pleased to see Thomas safe. They could not stay here. The house was compromised, probably under intermittent surveillance. And now he had a name. Hendricks. Someone important enough that the silver-haired man reported to him. Someone with enough resources to mount this kind of operation. Thomas led Copper deeper into the woods, moving north this time, away from the bunker site, away from the areas they would be searching. He needed to find shelter, somewhere he could think, somewhere he could examine the evidence from the bunker more carefully and figure out his next move. There was a place. An old hunting cabin about 3 miles into the northern section of his property, right up against the boundary with national forest land. His father had built it decades ago, a simple one-room structure with a wood stove and no electricity. Thomas had not visited it in over a year, not since the early days after he had moved back to the property. It was remote, difficult to access, and with luck, unknown to whoever was hunting him. The hike took 2 hours, moving carefully, taking a winding route that avoided the main trails. Thomas was operating on pure adrenaline now, his fatigue pushed aside by the demands of survival. Copper ranged ahead, his natural scouting instincts making him the perfect advance guard. The cabin appeared through the trees exactly where Thomas remembered it, a weathered structure with moss growing on the north-facing roof and saplings pressing close to the walls. The door hung slightly crooked on its hinges, and when Thomas pushed it open, the smell of mildew and rodent nests wafted out. But the structure was sound. The roof was intact. The single window was unbroken. It would serve. Thomas cleared a space on the floor, brushing away leaves and debris that had blown in under the door. He checked the wood stove, found the chimney clear, and started a small fire using birch bark and dry kindling he found stacked in a corner. The warmth was immediate and welcome, driving back the damp chill. Only then, with the fire crackling and copper lying by the door serving as an early warning system, did Thomas allow himself to fully examine what he had found. He pulled the journal and the lockbox from his jacket and spread the contents on the cabin's small table. The photographs were even more damning in the firelight. Thomas studied each one carefully, trying to match the locations in the images to places on his property. The concrete structure under construction appeared to be about a quarter mile from the bunker, in a low area that would have been hidden from casual view. The barrels of radioactive waste were arranged in neat rows, dozens of them, possibly hundreds. And in several photos, there were men in suits observing the work, clipboard-wielding bureaucrats or corporate representatives overseeing the illegal disposal. Thomas turned his attention to his grandfather's journal, reading the entries more carefully now. The old man had been methodical, recording dates, times, and descriptions of what he witnessed. But he had also been afraid. That fear bled through the words, especially in the later entries. One passage caught Thomas's attention. It was dated November 1963, just weeks before President Kennedy's assassination, a detail that seemed important though Thomas could not say why. They offered me $10,000 to keep quiet. When I refused, they said it would be unfortunate if something happened to the property, maybe a fire in the barn, maybe an accident with the tractor. I told them I had already documented everything, that if anything happened to me, the evidence would go to the newspapers. That seemed to give them pause. But I know they are watching. I see the same car on the road sometimes, always slowing down as it passes the driveway. I have hidden everything in the shelter, along with instructions for what to do with it. If they want it, they will have to tear this whole property apart to find it. But they had not torn the property apart. They had done something much simpler and more effective. They had waited. They had waited for Thomas's grandfather to die, whether naturally or with assistance. They had waited for his father to inherit the property and live his life in ignorance of what lay beneath his land. And they had waited for Thomas to come home from war, seeking isolation, never suspecting that his sanctuary sat atop a toxic secret. The question now was what to do with this information. Thomas pulled out the prepaid phone and stared at it. Who could he trust? The local police were out of the question. If this operation had been running since the 1960s, it had to have local protection, probably law enforcement and certainly political cover. The state police might be safer, but maybe not. This kind of conspiracy, with this kind of longevity, would have tendrils everywhere. Federal agencies? The EPA would be interested in illegal nuclear waste disposal, but how long would it take to cut through bureaucratic red tape? And in the meantime, how would he stay alive and free? The media was a possibility. His grandfather had mentioned newspapers, and in the digital age, exposure was even easier. But Thomas had no experience with journalists, did not know who to trust, and suspected that going public without proper protection would just paint a bigger target on his back. Then he thought of someone. Not a journalist, not law enforcement, but someone who might have the connections and the motivation to help. Captain Ellen Vasquez. She had been his company commander during his second deployment, a tough, principled officer who had gone on to work in military intelligence after leaving active duty. Thomas had not spoken to her in 5 years, but he remembered her as someone who played by the rules but was not afraid to challenge the system when the system was wrong. The question was whether her contact information was still good and whether she would even remember him. Thomas had been one of hundreds of Marines under her command over the years. But it was worth trying. It was his best option. He powered on the prepaid phone, grateful when it showed a weak but present signal. He would need to be brief, assume the call could be monitored or traced. He pulled up the browser and searched for Ellen Vasquez, filtering the results with keywords like military, intelligence, and consultant. It took 10 minutes, but he found her. She was listed as a senior associate at a private security and risk assessment firm based in Washington, D.C. The firm's website had a generic contact form, not useful for his purposes. But there was a phone number for their main office. Thomas checked his watch. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon. Business hours. He dialed, his heart rate picking up again. The phone rang 3 times before a professional-sounding receptionist answered. Sentinel Risk Solutions, how may I direct your call? Thomas kept his voice calm and professional. I need to speak with Ellen Vasquez. It's regarding a security matter. May I ask who is calling? Tell her it's a Marine from 2nd Battalion, 4th Regiment. It's urgent. There was a pause, the sound of typing. 1 moment please. The hold music was mercifully brief. Then a woman's voice came on the line, sharp and immediately alert. This is Vasquez. Who is this? Captain, this is Thomas Mercer. I served under you in Fallujah, 2006 to 2007. There was a pause, and then recognition in her voice. Mercer. I remember. You pulled Corporal Davis out of that collapsed building. Received a commendation. What's going on? The receptionist said this was urgent. Thomas chose his words carefully. I'm in Virginia, on property I inherited from my grandfather. I've discovered evidence of illegal activity, specifically illegal disposal of radioactive materials dating back to the 1960s. I've been surveilled and my home has been searched by individuals with significant resources and coordination. I believe my life is in danger, and I don't know who in local law enforcement can be trusted. Another pause, longer this time. Thomas could almost hear her mind working, assessing, calculating. Where are you right now? Remote location, my property. I have documentation and photographic evidence. I also have reason to believe this involves government or corporate entities with long-term operational capability. Don't move from where you are, Vasquez said, her voice crisp with command authority. Don't contact anyone else, don't use that phone again after this call. I'm going to make some calls to people I trust. How do I reach you? Thomas thought quickly. There's a town called Riverside, about 10 miles from my location. There's a diner called Maggie's on the main street. I can be there tomorrow morning at 8. Too public, Vasquez said. Behind the diner, there's a county maintenance facility, right? Thomas tried to visualize the area. Yes, I think so. Behind that facility, there's a fire access road. It's marked as no entry but it's rarely patrolled. Meet me there at 0800 hours. Come alone, and Mercer, assume you're being tracked. Ditch that phone after this call, move on foot if you can, and stay off main roads. Understood. And Mercer, if what you're telling me is real, if this is what it sounds like, we're talking about a very deep problem. People with that kind of secret to protect won't hesitate. Be careful. The line went dead. Thomas powered off the phone immediately, then used the cabin's wood stove to destroy it. He watched the plastic melt and burn, the circuit board blackening and warping in the flames. One less way for them to track him. He had until tomorrow morning. Roughly 16 hours to stay hidden, stay alive, and make it to that meeting. Thomas pulled out the energy bars from his pack and split one with copper, both of them chewing the chalky food without enthusiasm. Then he settled in to wait for darkness, knowing that night would offer his best chance of movement. As the sun set and the cabin grew dark except for the glow of the dying fire, Thomas found himself thinking about his grandfather. The old man had tried to do the right thing, had tried to expose a crime, and it had likely cost him his life. Now Thomas was following the same path, carrying the same burden of terrible knowledge. But unlike his grandfather, Thomas had training. He had survived 2 tours in a war zone. He knew how to move, how to hide, how to fight when fighting was necessary. He would not die quietly. He would not let this secret stay buried. And whoever had killed his grandfather, whoever had poisoned his land and threatened his life, they were about to learn that some veterans did not go quietly into the night. Thomas checked his weapons one more time, then stretched out on the cabin floor with his backpack as a pillow. Copper curled up against his side, a warm, solid presence in the darkness. Outside, the forest was alive with the sounds of night, owls calling and small animals rustling through the undergrowth. It was a peaceful sound, the sound of a world that continued on regardless of human schemes and crimes. But Thomas knew that peace was temporary. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges. The game had changed from simple survival to something larger. He was no longer just running. He was moving toward something. Toward justice. Toward answers. Toward the reckoning that his grandfather had started over 50 years ago. He closed his eyes, forcing his body to rest even as his mind continued to spin through possibilities and plans. Sleep came eventually, light and fitful, broken by the habits of a soldier who had learned that true rest was a luxury the vigilant could rarely afford. When Thomas woke, the cabin was still dark, but he could sense the approach of dawn and the quality of the silence. He checked his watch. 4:30 in the morning. Time to move. He woke Copper with a gentle touch, gathered his minimal supplies, and kicked dirt over the remains of the fire. The hike to Riverside would take at least 3 hours on foot, moving carefully through the national forest to avoid his own property where they would be watching. Thomas locked the cabin behind him, though he suspected he would never return to it. That part of his life, the illusion of peaceful isolation, was over. Whatever came next would be different. They set out into the pre-dawn darkness, Thomas using a small red-filtered flashlight to navigate, Coppa's superior night vision making him the natural leader. The forest was vast and patient, keeping its secrets, sheltering them as they moved through its depths toward an uncertain future and a meeting that would determine whether Thomas would survive to tell the story his grandfather had died trying to expose. The national forest was a different world in the pre-dawn hours. Thomas moved through it like a shadow, his boots finding purchase on ground softened by decades of accumulated pine needles. Copper stayed close, the dog's breathing barely audible even in the profound silence that preceded sunrise. They had been moving for 2 hours, circling wide around Thomas's property, staying well within the federal land where his pursuers would have no legal authority to operate openly. The forest here was older, less managed than his family's land. Massive hemlocks towered overhead, their branches creating a canopy so dense that even with dawn approaching, the ground remained in deep twilight. Thomas paused occasionally to check his bearing using a compass, refusing to rely on any electronic device that could be traced or tracked. His military training had emphasized the basics, the skills that worked when technology failed, and he was grateful for that education now. As the sky began to lighten, Thomas found what he was looking for. A rocky outcrop that rose above the forest floor, offering a vantage point over the valley below. He could see the distant lights of Riverside beginning to flicker on as the town woke. Somewhere down there was the maintenance facility and the fire access road where he would meet Captain Vasquez in less than 2 hours. Thomas used the time to prepare himself mentally. He reviewed everything he knew, organizing the facts in his mind the way he had been taught to organize intelligence briefings. His grandfather had discovered illegal dumping of radioactive waste on family property in the early 1960s. He had documented it with photographs and detailed journal entries. He had been threatened, possibly killed, to keep that secret. The waste was still there, buried somewhere on the property, a toxic legacy that had been hidden for over 50 years. And now, someone with significant resources was desperate to keep it hidden, desperate enough to mount a sophisticated operation to eliminate anyone who knew the truth. The question that gnawed at Thomas was why now? Why, after all these years, did they suddenly care? His grandfather had been neutralized decades ago. The secret had seemingly died with him. What had changed? What had Thomas done, other than break open an old bunker, that had triggered this response? Unless they had been watching all along. Unless every property owner, every heir who inherited that land, had been under surveillance. Waiting. Making sure the secret stayed buried. The thought was chilling, but it made a terrible kind of sense. If you had invested this much in hiding a crime, you would not simply assume it would stay hidden. You would watch. You would maintain readiness. And the moment anyone got close to the truth, you would act. Which meant his father had probably been watched too. His grandfather certainly had been. Thomas wondered if his father had ever suspected, if he had ever seen the signs but chosen to ignore them, choosing willful ignorance over dangerous knowledge. It would explain why the old man had never spoken of his own father with anything but terse, uncomfortable silence. The sky continued to brighten, shifting from black to deep purple to a pale gray that promised another cold, clear day. Thomas descended from the outcrop and began the final approach to Riverside. He kept to the tree line, moving parallel to the main road but staying well back in the cover of the forest. Copper remained alert, his ears constantly swiveling, processing sounds that Thomas's merely human hearing could not detect. They reached the edge of town just after 7:30. Thomas found a concealed position in a stand of scrub oak that gave him a view of the county maintenance facility. It was exactly as he remembered it, a cluster of utilitarian buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence. Equipment yards held road graders and dump trucks. Salt domes stood ready for winter storms. And behind it all, barely visible, was the fire access road Vasquez had mentioned. Thomas watched for 30 minutes, looking for anything out of place. He saw maintenance workers arriving for their shifts, saw a supervisor unlock the main gate, saw the mundane routine of a small-town public works department beginning its day. Nothing seemed wrong. No suspicious vehicles. No one watching the area. But that meant nothing. Professional surveillance was designed to be invisible. At 7:55, Thomas made his move. He circled around to approach the fire access road from the forest side, avoiding any path that would take him past security cameras or through areas where he might be easily observed. The road was exactly where it should be, a gravel track with a rusted gate and a faded sign reading "Authorized Personnel Only." Thomas slipped past the gate and moved up the road, staying to the side where the tree cover was thickest. Copper stayed close, his body language relaxed but attentive. And then, at exactly 8 o'clock, a dark sedan came up the fire road from the opposite direction. It stopped 50 yards from Thomas's position, and a woman got out. Captain Ellen Vasquez looked older than Thomas remembered, but the years had been kind to her. She was in her late 40s now, her dark hair shorter than she had worn it in the Corps, shot through with distinguished streaks of silver. She wore civilian clothes, dark jeans and a leather jacket, but something in the way she carried herself still screamed military. She scanned the area with professional efficiency, then called out in a voice that carried clearly in the morning air. "Mercer, I'm alone. You can come out." Thomas emerged from the trees, Copper at his side. Vasquez's eyes went to the dog first, assessing him with the practiced gaze of someone who understood tactical animals, then to Thomas. Her expression softened slightly. "You look like hell, Marine. It's been a rough couple of days, ma'am." She gestured to her car. "Get in. We need to talk, and we need to do it somewhere less exposed than this." Thomas hesitated. Every instinct told him not to get into a vehicle with someone else in control. But he had initiated this contact. He had asked for help. And Captain Vasquez had driven through the night to meet him, which suggested she took his situation seriously. He got in the passenger seat, Copper jumping into the back. Vasquez drove, taking them further up the fire road until they reached a turnaround point with a view over the valley. She killed the engine and turned to face him. Talk. Tell me everything. Thomas did. He started with finding the bunker, walked her through the discovery of his grandfather's journal and the photographs, described the search teams on his property and the conversation he had overheard at his house. He pulled out the evidence, spreading the photographs on the dashboard, letting her read selected passages from the journal. Through it all, Vasquez listened without interruption, her face a mask of professional neutrality. When he finished, she sat silent for a long moment, her fingers drumming on the steering wheel. Finally, she spoke. "This is bigger than I thought. A lot bigger. You believe me?" Vasquez gave him a sharp look. "I wouldn't have driven 6 hours in the middle of the night if I thought you were delusional. But believing you and being able to help you are two different things. What you've stumbled into is a multi-decade cover-up involving illegal disposal of nuclear materials. That suggests government involvement, probably military or Department of Energy. It also suggests corporate partners, whoever actually produced the waste that needed disposing. And it suggests a network of protection that has survived multiple administrations and generations of personnel changes. So what do I do?" Vasquez reached into her jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside was a phone, newer than the prepaid unit Thomas had destroyed. There was also a business card with a handwritten number. "That phone is clean and encrypted. The number on that card belongs to a friend of mine in the Inspector General's office at the Department of Energy. His name is Robert Chen. He's spent his career investigating waste disposal irregularities, and more importantly, he's completely incorruptible. I called him last night after we spoke. He's expecting your call." Thomas took the phone and the card. "And then what?" "Then you turn over everything you have. Chen will initiate an investigation, but it will take time. These things always do. In the meantime, you cannot go home. You cannot stay in Virginia. The people hunting you have resources and they've already proven they're willing to act. You need to disappear until Chen can provide official protection. I don't have anywhere to go." Vasquez pulled out another card, this one with an address in Pennsylvania written on it. "That's a property owned by my firm. It's off the books, used for protective custody situations. You can stay there as long as necessary. I'll provide transportation." Thomas looked at the cards in his hand, then at Copper, then back at Vasquez. "Why are you doing this?" "I was just another Marine in your company. You must have had hundreds of us over the years." Something flickered in Vasquez's eyes, something old and painful. "You remember Sergeant Kowalski?" Thomas did. Kowalski had been a squad leader, killed by an IED in their second month in country. A good man, a career Marine who had been 3 months from retirement. "Kowalski found something he shouldn't have," Vasquez said quietly. "Evidence of contractor fraud, millions of dollars being funneled through shell companies. He reported it through channels. And 2 weeks later, that IED went off under his Humvee. The official report said it was bad luck, wrong place, wrong time. But I've always wondered if someone made sure he was in that wrong place." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning cold. "You think he was killed to cover up fraud? I think the world is full of people who will do anything to protect their interests. I think your grandfather learned that. Kowalski might have learned it. And you're learning it now. So yes, Mercer, I'm helping you. Because maybe this time, the good guys can actually win." Before Thomas could respond, Kappa's head snapped up. The dog stared at the road behind them, a low growl starting in his chest. Vasquez saw it too, her hand immediately going to a pistol Thomas had not realized she was carrying. "Company," she said tersely. A vehicle was coming up the fire road, moving fast. It was another SUV, dark and expensive, the same type Thomas had seen at his property. It skidded to a stop 50 yards away, blocking the road. 4 men got out, and Thomas recognized one of them immediately. The silver-haired man from the bunker. Vasquez's jaw tightened. "This is not good. Did you check for tracking devices? Did they tag your dog?" Thomas's mind raced. The house. They had been in his house while he was hiding in the pantry. Copper had been outside, waiting. They could have tagged him then, a small GPS device attached to his collar, so subtle Thomas would never have noticed in the chaos of fleeing. His hand went to Copper's collar, and there it was. A small black device no larger than a button, magnetically attached to the metal buckle. Thomas ripped it off and threw it into the woods, but the damage was done. They had been tracked directly to this location. Vasquez started the engine. "Hold on." She threw the car into reverse, backing up the fire road at dangerous speed. But the road only went another 100 yards before it dead-ended at a trailhead parking area. They were trapped, caught between the SUV behind them and impassable terrain ahead. The SUV advanced slowly, deliberately. The four men spread out, moving with tactical precision. They were not local thugs or hired muscle. These were professionals, possibly military or former military themselves. Vasquez assessed the situation with rapid, clinical efficiency. "We can't fight our way through four armed men. We can't outrun them in a vehicle on a dead-end road. So we do what we do best. We go to ground." She grabbed a go bag from her trunk, handed Thomas a tactical vest with plate carrier, and they ran. Not down the road where they would be easy targets, but straight into the dense forest, moving perpendicular to the road, seeking the deepest cover available. Copper bounded ahead, his natural instincts making him a perfect pathfinder. Behind them, Thomas heard shouting, the sounds of men organizing a pursuit. But the forest was thick here, the undergrowth almost impenetrable. Vasquez moved with impressive speed for someone who spent most of her time behind a desk now, and Thomas had to push himself to keep up, his body still running on the adrenaline and limited food of the past 2 days. They ran for 20 minutes before Vasquez signaled a halt. They were deep in the forest now, in a ravine thick with rhododendron and mountain laurel. They could hear their pursuers, but the sounds were distant and disorganized. The men were searching, but they had lost the immediate trail. Vasquez pulled out a phone, different from the one she had given Thomas, and made a call. Her voice was low and urgent. "This is Vasquez. I have a situation. 4 hostiles, possibly armed, pursuing us in national forest land approximately 3 miles northwest of Riverside, Virginia. I need immediate law enforcement response and I need it federal. Local jurisdiction is potentially compromised." She listened, then responded. "Yes, I'm certain. And yes, I'm calling in that favor. Send everyone you can." She ended the call and looked at Thomas. "Federal park rangers will be here in 20 minutes. State police in 30. But we need to stay mobile and stay alive until they arrive. Those men cannot afford to let us reach official protection. Everything they've worked for, everything they've hidden, it all falls apart if we testify." "Who are they?" Thomas asked. "Who's really behind this?" Vasquez was checking the magazine in her pistol, counting rounds. "Based on what you found and the resources they've demonstrated, I'd say you're dealing with either a government black site operation that was never properly decommissioned or a corporate entity with deep connections to the defense establishment. Probably both. In the early 60s, the nuclear industry was largely unregulated. Waste was a problem no one wanted to acknowledge. Private contractors were paid to make it disappear, and they did exactly that. They buried it, dumped it, hid it in places they thought no one would ever look. Your grandfather's land was probably one of dozens of disposal sites across the country. And they're still protecting it? After all these years?" Vasquez nodded grimly. "Because if one site is exposed, it opens the door to investigating all of them. We're talking about potential liability in the billions of dollars. Environmental cleanup costs. Cancer clusters. Poison groundwater. Class action lawsuits that could bankrupt companies and end careers. That's worth killing for some people." A sound to their left. Footsteps, carefully placed. One of the pursuers had circled around, trying to flank their position. Vasquez raised her weapon, and Thomas did the same with the pistol from his backpack. Copper growled softly, his hackles raised. The man appeared through the trees, and Thomas recognized him as the younger of the two men he had seen at his house. The man saw them in the same instant, his own weapon coming up. But Copper was faster. The dog launched himself forward, 80 pounds of trained fury hitting the man's center mass. The man went down with a shout of surprise and pain, his weapon flying into the underbrush. Thomas was on him in seconds, using zip ties from Vasquez's go bag to secure his hands behind his back. The man struggled, cursing, but Thomas had size and training on his side. Within 30 seconds, the threat was neutralized. Vasquez was already on her radio. 1 hostile secured. 3 still mobile in the area. She checked the man's pockets, finding a wallet with ID and a phone. She photographed both with her personal device, then removed the phone's battery. The man spat blood, glaring up at them. "You have no idea what you're doing. The people I work for, they don't give up. They don't stop. You've signed your own death warrant." Vasquez knelt beside him, her voice cold as winter steel. "The people you work for are about to have a very bad day. Federal agents are en route to this location. By tonight, your entire operation will be under investigation. And you're going to have a choice. You can go down with the ship, or you can cooperate and maybe spend less time in a federal prison." The man laughed bitterly. "You think I'm afraid of prison? I'm more afraid of what happens if I talk. You don't betray people like Hendricks and live to regret it." There was the name again. Hendricks. The person the silver-haired man had been reporting to. Thomas leaned in. "Who is Hendricks?" The man's expression shifted to something like pity. "You really don't know? You really have no idea how deep this goes? Hendricks isn't just some corporate executive. He's connected at the highest levels. Pentagon. Department of Energy. Congressional oversight committees. He's untouchable." Vasquez stood up. "No one is untouchable. Not anymore." The sound of sirens, faint but growing closer. The cavalry was arriving. The other 3 pursuers must have heard it too, because the sounds of their search suddenly ceased, replaced by the noise of rapid retreat. They were cutting their losses, abandoning their captured colleague and fleeing before law enforcement arrived. Within 10 minutes, the forest was alive with federal park rangers and Virginia State Police. Vasquez handled the initial contact, showing credentials that carried weight even among law enforcement. She gave a carefully edited version of events, enough to justify their presence in the restrained man, but not so much that it would complicate the larger investigation. The captured man was taken into custody, read his rights, and transported away in the back of a state police vehicle. Thomas and Vasquez were separated, each giving detailed statements to different officers. The process took hours, the morning sliding into afternoon, Thomas's exhaustion finally catching up with him now that the immediate danger had passed. Eventually, Vasquez found him sitting on a fallen log at the edge of the trailhead parking area, Copper lying at his feet. She had 2 bottles of water and a protein bar, which she handed to Thomas. "Chin is flying in tonight," she said. "He's bringing a team from the IG's office. They'll want to go over everything you found, and they'll want to examine the bunker site personally. In the meantime, you're officially under federal protection. No going home, no contact with anyone who might be compromised. You're going to Pennsylvania whether you like it or not." Thomas took a long drink of water. "What about my sister?" "If they were watching her apartment." "Already handled. Chen's office contacted her 2 hours ago. She's being moved to a secure location. She's fine, and she knows you're safe." Thomas felt a weight lift from his chest that he had not realized he was carrying. His sister was the only family he had left, the only person in the world who would genuinely mourn if he disappeared. Knowing she was protected mattered more than he wanted to admit. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now the bureaucracy takes over," Vasquez said. "Chen's investigation will move slowly but thoroughly. They'll excavate the burial site. They'll test soil and groundwater. They'll track down records, interview witnesses, build a case. It could take months, maybe years. But eventually, Everyone involved will face consequences. The contractors who did the dumping. The officials who covered it up. The people who killed your grandfather and who tried to kill you. And Hendricks? Vasquez's expression darkened. That's the wild card. If he's as connected as our friend suggested, he'll have lawyers and political protection. But even powerful people can fall if the evidence is solid enough. Your grandfather made sure the evidence was solid. You made sure it survived. That's going to matter. They sat in silence for a moment, watching as the last of the law enforcement vehicles prepared to leave. The forest around them was peaceful again, as if the violence and chaos of the morning had been nothing more than a brief disturbance in its ancient rhythm. Thomas thought about his grandfather, about the old man's courage in documenting a crime he knew could get him killed. He thought about his own journey from isolated veteran to reluctant whistleblower. And he thought about the land, the 40 acres that had been in his family for 3 generations, now revealed as both sanctuary and tomb. Can I ever go back? He asked quietly. To the property, I mean. Will it ever be safe? Vasquez considered the question. Honestly? Probably not. The cleanup alone will take years, maybe decades. And even after it's clean, you'll always know what was buried there. You'll always see it differently. Thomas nodded slowly. He had already suspected as much. The isolation he had sought, the peace he thought he had found, it had all been an illusion built on poisoned ground. But maybe that was appropriate. Maybe he had been running from his past instead of dealing with it, hiding instead of healing. And maybe this crisis, terrible as it was, had forced him back into the world, back into engagement with something larger than his own pain. Copper nudged his hand with a cold nose, and Thomas scratched behind the dog's ears. At least he had not been alone. Through everything, Copper had been there. Warning him. Protecting him. Keeping him anchored to the present moment. Whatever came next, whatever trials and testimony and investigation lay ahead, he would face it with his most loyal companion at his side. 3 weeks later, Thomas stood in a nondescript office building in Washington, D.C., looking at a wall covered in maps and documents. Robert Chin was at his side, pointing to various marked locations on a large map of the eastern United States. We've identified 17 sites so far, Chin said. 17 locations where illegal nuclear waste disposal occurred between 1961 and 1968. Your grandfather's land was one of the smaller sites, actually. Some of these others, his finger traced to marks in Tennessee, South Carolina, and Ohio, these held thousands of barrels. The environmental damage is catastrophic. Thomas studied the map, seeing the scope of the conspiracy laid bare. How many people knew? Chin shook his head. That's what we're still trying to determine. At minimum, dozens. At maximum, hundreds. We have evidence of bribes paid to local officials, inspectors who looked the other way, trucking companies that moved the waste, contractors who did the actual burial. It's a web that touches multiple states and involves both government and private sector actors. And Hendricks? Chen's expression grew hard. Marcus Hendricks. Former Deputy Undersecretary for Nuclear Energy. Currently CEO of Hendricks Industrial Solutions, one of the largest environmental remediation companies in the country. The irony is almost beautiful. He helped create the mess in the 60s, and now he profits from cleaning it up, except he makes sure certain sites never get discovered. Can you prosecute him? We're building the case. Your grandfather's documentation was the key that opened the door. We've been able to cross-reference his photographs with transportation records, budget documents, personnel assignments. We can place Hendricks at multiple sites. We can prove he had knowledge. Whether we can prove he ordered your grandfather's death is harder, but the conspiracy charges alone should be sufficient. Thomas turned away from the map. In the 3 weeks since his escape into the forest, his life had transformed completely. He had given hours of testimony. He had guided investigators to the bunker and watched as they carefully excavated the contents. He had identified locations in his grandfather's photographs, helping Chen's team build a timeline of the illegal operations. And he had begun, slowly, to heal. The nightmares that had plagued him for years had not disappeared, but they had changed. He was no longer dreaming of Fallujah, of smoke and blood and screams. Instead, he dreamed of his grandfather, a man he barely remembered, standing in the forest and watching the trucks come. Bearing witness. Refusing to look away. "Your sister wants to see you," Chen said, pulling Thomas from his thoughts. "She's waiting in the conference room." Thomas found her there, sitting at a long table with a laptop open in front of her. She looked up when he entered, and her face broke into a smile that was equal parts relief and exasperation. "You've had quite the adventure," she said, standing to hug him. Thomas held her tight, feeling the solid reality of her presence, the proof that she was safe and alive despite the danger he had brought into both their lives. "I'm sorry," he said, "for dragging you into this." She pulled back, giving him a stern look. "Don't apologize for doing the right thing. Granddad would be proud." "I'm proud." They talked for an hour, catching up on the weeks they had spent apart, she in her own protective custody, he in the Pennsylvania safe house. She told him about the interviews she had given to journalists, about the media attention that was building as news of the investigation leaked to the press. She told him about the calls from environmental groups, from veterans organizations, from people who wanted to help or who had their own stories of contamination and cover-up. "You're going to be famous," she said. "The veteran who exposed a decades-old nuclear cover-up. That's a hell of a story." Thomas grimaced. "I don't want to be famous. I just want the people responsible held accountable." "You don't get to choose," she said gently. "This is bigger than you now. This is history. But for what it's worth, you're handling it well. Better than I would have expected, honestly. A year ago, you were hiding on that property, barely talking to anyone. Now look at you." Thomas considered that. She was right. A year ago, even a month ago, this situation would have overwhelmed him. The attention, the pressure, the constant demands on his time and energy, it all would have sent him retreating back into isolation. But something had changed. Maybe it was the mission, having a clear objective that mattered. Maybe it was copper, the constant reminder that he was not alone. Or maybe it was simply time, the slow accumulation of days putting distance between who he had been in the war and who he was becoming after it. "What are you going to do?" his sister asked. "After this is over, I mean. Assuming you survive the media circus." Thomas had been thinking about that question a lot lately. The property was gone, not legally but practically. It would be years before it could be cleaned up, and even then, he could never live there again knowing what lay beneath. But that was okay. He did not need 40 acres to hide in anymore. "Vasquez offered me a job," he said. "At her firm. Investigative work, risk assessment. Helping people who've stumbled into situations they don't understand." His sister smiled. "That sounds perfect for you. Way better than hiding in the woods." The Pennsylvania safe house had been comfortable enough, but Thomas had been restless there, caged by protection. He wanted to move, to act, to do something useful. Vasquez's offer had come at exactly the right time, a path forward that used his skills and his experience for something meaningful. Over the following months, Thomas watched as the investigation unfolded in the public eye. News organizations ran exposés on the illegal dumping. Congressional hearings were convened. Marcus Hendricks resigned from his position as CEO and hired an army of lawyers to fight the charges against him. Cleanup efforts began at multiple sites, massive undertakings that would cost billions and take decades to complete. And through it all, Thomas's grandfather's journal remained at the center of it, the primary evidence, the first-hand account that made everything else possible. Historians called it one of the most important documents of environmental crime in American history. Thomas just called it justice, delayed but finally delivered. On a cold morning in February, nearly 6 months after Thomas had first opened that bunker hatch, he stood at a newly installed memorial in what had once been his grandfather's property. The land had been seized by the government as part of the investigation, but Chen had arranged for this, a simple granite marker bearing his grandfather's name and dates. Richard Mercer, the inscription read. 1923 to 1965. He saw the truth and refused to stay silent. Thomas placed a hand on the cold stone, Copper sitting quietly at his side. Around them, the forest stretched in every direction, beautiful and deadly, hiding its poisons beneath a surface of peace. But the truth was coming out now, being exposed to light and air. The healing could begin. Vasquez stood a respectful distance away, giving Thomas his moment of private reflection. When he finally turned from the memorial, she approached with a folder in her hands. First assignment, she said. Family in Oregon. They bought land cheap, started having health problems. Local government says there's no issue, but the family's not buying it. They need someone who understands how these things work. Someone who's been through it. Thomas took the folder, flipped it open, scanned the initial report. It had the familiar pattern, the telltale signs of something buried and forgotten, now coming back to poison the living. He closed the folder and nodded. When do we leave? Tomorrow, if you're ready. It's a long way from Virginia. Thomas looked back at the memorial one last time, at his grandfather's name carved in stone, at the forest that held so many secrets. Then he looked down at Copper, who gazed up at him with steady, trusting eyes. The dog's tail wagged once, a simple affirmation. Ready when you are. I'm ready, Thomas said. They walked back through the forest together, the three of them, veterans of a different kind of war. Behind them, the memorial stood silent, bearing witness as the forest had always borne witness, patient and eternal. The past could not be changed, but it could be acknowledged. The dead could not be brought back, but they could be honored. And the living could choose, every day, whether to look away or to stand and face the truth, no matter the cost. Thomas had made his choice. He would not look away. Not anymore. Not ever again. The forest path led them back to their vehicle, back to the world of ongoing investigations and new cases and people who needed help navigating systems designed to hide uncomfortable truths. It was not the quiet life Thomas had thought he wanted when he first came home from war. But it was the life he needed, the life that gave his experience meaning and his pain purpose. As they drove away from the property for the last time, Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest was already reclaiming the access road, branches reaching across the gravel, leaves beginning to cover the tire tracks. In a year, you would never know anyone had been there. In 10 years, the memorial itself might be swallowed by undergrowth. But the truth would remain, preserved in documents and testimonies and the memories of those who had fought to bring it to light. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because in the end, that was all anyone could do. Bear witness. Tell the truth. And trust that it mattered, even when the darkness seemed overwhelming, even when the forces arrayed against justice seemed insurmountable. One person, one dog, one buried secret brought to light. It was not much, measured against the scope of the world's wrongs. But it was something. And sometimes, something was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.